Good morning, everybody. Hope we're doing really good today. Welcome back to the channel. There's a new ETF coming out, and its claim to fame is that it pays out weekly income. Says it's an innovator, that it's the first ETF that provides weekly income. I don't like that. It's silly. You don't need that in an ETF. And it's got a high expense ratio, too. Little spoiler alert for you. Yeah, the thing's a gimmick. I don't like it. We're going to talk a little bit about this, and we're going to dig into how much weekly distributions would actually mean for this fund. It's brand new, so we don't have all the information. It has no track record yet. So we're going to make some assumptions and some guesses to see how weekly distributions would work. Before we talk about that, though, if you're new to the channel, I'm Just. I like to talk about dividend investing, income from options, financial independence, and document my own journey towards financial independence. So I really appreciate it if you give a little thumbs up for this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So yeah, okay, let's talk about this TGIF. That's such a silly name. I don't like it. There's a whole bunch of hits for weekly income on YouTube. You got weekly income through options trading, easiest profit method, weekly income strategy, weekly options, selling puts, generating weekly income, weekly paychecks, generating income from selling weekly options. You get it. A whole bunch of stuff in here about getting weekly income. And I understand that it feels nice. It feels really good to get paid more often than not. Like, I delivered pizza for a long time, and I always thought it was a really good feeling how I would leave work with more money than when I went to work. So getting paid, there is an effect that people have. It has an effect on the mind that, you know, the more you get paid, it feels good to feel that reward. So this new ETF, TGIF, it's a bond fund that tries to pay out weekly income. So it's from this SoFi. I imagine it's SoFi because that Phi is probably financial, huh? TGIF. Get paid weekly with the SoFi Weekly Income ETF, TGIF, an actively managed ETF, which means it's expensive, seeks to provide weekly income by investing in investment grade and high yield fixed securities. It expects to distribute on Fridays. Oh, really? Yeah, actively managed, value-oriented fixed income, blah, blah, blah. Portfolio will target a duration of less than 3 years with a goal to reduce interest rate risk relative to longer dated bonds. So yeah, less than 3 years will be a little bit safer because there's less things that can go wrong in a shorter time frame with bonds. And it's really new. It looks like it's trading right now, but there's no mention of yield. We don't know what this thing is gonna yield yet. But it has a really high expense ratio of 0.59%. That's pretty high for an ETF. But this is like a gimmick and kind of a niche product, so it can kind of demand that kind of expense ratio. TGIF is the first ever ETF that seeks to distribute income on a weekly basis. Like, you just don't need that. If you need money on a weekly basis, you need to get better with your personal finance and start budgeting better. Diversified. Exposure to 30 bonds across multiple industries and capital structures helps manage risk. Well, there's a whole bunch of other bond ETFs that have thousands and thousands of bonds in there, so may not be the most diversified, but the odds of, you know, one of these going bankrupt and not paying out its bond payments and defaulting won't hurt you too bad with 30 bonds. If it goes to zero, that's like 3% loss in the fund. Actively managed means it's expensive. Short duration, which would be, I think that'd be all right. Better than longer duration, especially with interest rate risks. Top 10 holdings. We have 9% of the fund in cash. Ford, about 4% of the fund. Aviation Capital, 3%. Bunch of stuff I've never heard of before. Wyndham Hotel, they're probably not making a lot of money right now with no travel. Talks about investing in junk bonds. High yield securities carry a greater degree of risk and are more volatile than investment grade securities and are considered speculative. Now, there are other junk bond funds out there and other high yield bond funds out there and that have more securities, lower expense ratio. One of them that I'm looking at here that I'll show you is the Spider Portfolio High Yield Bond ETF, ticker SPHY. Spider High Yield. That's what that ticker will stand for. This thing is a little bit better than, this is definitely better than TGIF. And this has an expense ratio of 0.15. That's like 4 times cheaper than the expense ratio on TGIF. This thing's current yield is 6%. It does pay out monthly, and it has 1,682 holdings. So it's a bit more diversified than our TGIF. It's got a pretty high yield. We don't even know what TGIF's yield is going to be. And what is it? Average maturity in years, 6.32 years is the average maturity on this ETF. When TGIF, their maturity was less than 3 years. Now, I definitely think this ETF is better than TGIF. But what I want to do is, or what I did want to do, and what I did do, is I made up an Excel spreadsheet where I compare something like the Spider High Yield Bond ETF, and I compared it to TGIF with yield being the same. We don't know what TGIF's yield is going to be, not yet. We'll figure that out in the future. But if everything was equal, I want to just focus on how much difference getting paid weekly is with that higher expense ratio versus monthly with this lower expense ratio. So I'm not trying to compare the performance of these two funds because TGIF has no performance yet. But what I'm trying to do is just isolate how much that weekly premium is worth and how the expense ratio affects that. Okay? Okay. So on the left, we have something like SPHY, and on the right, we have something like TGIF. They both have a 6% yield. SPHY has our low expense ratio of 0.15%, and TGIF is 0.59%. We start out with $10,000, and we don't add extra money at all, just because we want to see how much the expense ratio affects and how much the frequency of distributions affects the overall return. And we drag this out for 30 years. So we get, we got a little amortization sheet with reinvesting all our money. And then at the end of the first year, we subtract our expense ratio. So let's go ahead, fast forward all the way to 30 years. Now, at the end of 30 years, at the end of 1,560 weeks, we have $66,866 in our monthly distributions with a lower expense ratio, but we have only $50,000. We have $50,600 in our weekly distributions with the higher expense ratio. Since that higher expense ratio is 4 times as much, we're giving up a lot more money to fees, and that money, it kind of compounds just like regular returns do, but the compounding is bad and it's money that you never get to see. And here it's $16,000 worth having that higher expense ratio. It completely makes the point of, weekly distributions. It completely just negates that and makes the weekly distributions worthless. So on one hand, you have SDHY, has much more diversification, has a yield. You are getting you're getting monthly distributions instead of weekly, and a much lower expense ratio. When TGIF, you have like 30 bonds in there, much less diversification. It is a shorter duration, so there's less things that can go wrong in a bond fund like that. And but the higher expense ratio of 0.59, it completely takes away any benefit you get from that weekly distribution. You like to think that if you're getting paid weekly, that's more time for your more opportunity to reinvest and more time that your money compounds, but that expense ratio just eats away all that benefit. So those are my thoughts on this. That, there's just it's just a gimmick, and with the high expense ratio, it's just not worth doing. It's silly. It's a gimmick. I wouldn't invest my money in it. But none of this is financial advice. You can go ahead and do whatever you want to do. You can buy whatever you want. I'm not here to tell you what to do. You should speak to a professional, do your own due diligence and research about this kind of stuff. But I think that's all I got for this video. Hope you enjoy it. Hope you learn something. If you did, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Give me a little thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I'll put some other cool videos over here that we can watch. And then I hope you go have a good day, all right?